Everyone, and welcome to our first gender-based violence virtual panel. My name is Jenna Holt, and I am the coordinator of Northeast Regional Victim Services. I want to do a quick announcement before we get started with our event today by saying if anybody is in an unsafe situation, please know that there is going to be a written transcript of today's entire virtual panel. We don't want to put anybody in an unsafe situation, so please reach out to us if you need it, but it will be posted to our social media platforms as well. So I'm excited, and I want to start off with some thank yous first. First thank you is to our viewers, that's you, for taking the time to view our panel today and to submit those questions. We truly appreciate it. What we'd really like now is that you like, share, send the link to anybody that needs to know this information, would like to learn more, just so we get that awareness out. That's the whole point of today's panel, is to get that awareness and the support that's available to you. My next thank you is to all the amazing panelists today. We truly appreciate all of your knowledge and expertise that you're going to be bringing today to our panel and the time that you put into doing it. Huge thank you from myself and my team at Northeast Regional Victim Services. Thank you. My next thank you is to the Canadian Women's Foundation. We did receive a grant to be able to put on this awareness campaign. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do this today. So a huge thank you to you guys. We will be using their link in a couple of our answers. So please check out their website. It will be linked below. And I also want to talk about how are these questions coming about? How did this virtual panel start? Well, that is from you, the viewers. You guys presented the questions that you had about gender-based violence, and we put them together with this amazing team of panelists to answer those questions. So thanks again. Some of the events that we hosted as Victim Services is we did a partnership with local restaurants in our communities to give back to the community for those questions. We gave away free appetizers. The other one that we did is we partnered up with a local gym and gave away a 6-month gym membership for questions. And that really did coincide with our mandate with Victim Services to return people to wellness. So we thought that was a great partnership, and thank you to everybody that helped us out. So that was great, and those questions that you guys submitted are going to be answered. So hopefully we get through all of them. If any questions were missed, please reach out to us. We'll answer them to you. We'll give them to you. And last, I'm going to pass it over to Trisha Hartman, my assistant coordinator. She is going to be the moderator of today's event. I tend to be long-winded, as you've probably already noticed, so she'll be able to moderate today, and we actually were able to keep Trisha on until the end of the year with this grant. So she is primarily focusing on gender-based violence victims and survivors and providing that awareness piece to it. So we get to be a little bit more proactive instead of reactive as a victim services program. So Trish, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Jenna. And before we begin, I would like to introduce our panel regarding your job title. First, we'll start with Jenna Holt.
Hello again. So I'm Jenna Holt. I am the coordinator of Northeast Regional Victim Services. I am based out of Tisdale, and I've been with Victim Services in Saskatchewan for a total of 5 years, but in Tisdale with this program for 3.
Thank you, Jenna. Rod McKendrick.
Hi, I'm Rod McKendrick. I'm the interpersonal violence specialist with the Ministry of Justice in Victim Services. I've been with this area for almost 17 years. Prior to that, I was a police officer. And as you can tell with the accent, not originally from here.
Thank you, Rod. Tina Platt.
About that. Hi, I'm Constable Tina Platford. I am with the Internet Child Exploitation Team here in Regina. I work all over Saskatchewan, and I currently am very passionate about human trafficking, and I still support members in that field, and I still do presentations on human trafficking.
Thank you, Tina. Haley Kennedy.
Hello, everyone. I am Haley Kennedy, and I'm the Executive Director for Partners Family Services, serving rural central Saskatchewan. And I've currently been in this role with Partners as the Executive Director for the past 6 years.
Thank you, Haley. Julie Cassidy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Cassidy, and I'm a personal violence counselor with Northeast Outreach and Support Services. And I run the NIP1 satellite office and have been with them since 2016.
Thank you, Julie. Joelle Nyman.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joelle Nyman. I'm with the RCMP as the Relationship Violence Coordinator. I've been a constable with the RCMP for the last 15 years. And my role currently is to develop initiatives and strategies and work collaboratively with our partner agencies to combat and deal with gender-based violence within Saskatchewan.
Thanks, Joelle. Wade Rogers.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wade Rogers. I am a senior Crown prosecutor with public prosecutions through the Ministry of Justice. I'm based out of Melfort, and I've been with them for the past 7 years.
Thanks, Wade. Next, we have Jess Fisher.
Hey everyone, my name is Jess Fisher. My pronouns are she and they, and I am the Gender-Based Violence Education Coordinator at Out Saskatoon, Saskatoon's 2S LGBTQ organization, and we're located in Saskatoon on Treaty 6. And I've been with the organization now for 4 years.
Thank you, Jess. And Connor Rodriguez.
Hi, my name is Connor Rodriguez. I use the pronouns he and him. I also work at Out Saskatoon alongside Jess, who's our team lead on the Gender-Based Violence Project. I'm the community support advocate. I've been with Out Saskatoon working for 2 years, but I volunteered for Out Saskatoon for many years and was a member at large on the board of directors for 2 years prior.
Thank you, Connor. So now we're going to start with our questions. To begin with, we're going to discuss characteristics of gender-based violence. What are the types, characteristics of gender-based violence? Rod?
To give everybody a shortened version of what the full version is, everyone has the right to live free from violence, but many Canadians across the country continue to face violence every day because of their gender, their gender expression, gender identity, or perceived gender. Experiencing any of these types of violence constitutes gender-based violence, which is a violation of human rights. However, gender-based violence can take many forms. When we look at cyber, physical, sexual, societal, psychological, emotional, and economic, even including neglect and discrimination and harassment can also be forms of gender-based violence. And while violence affects people of all genders and ages, religions, cultures, ethnicities, geographic locations, and socio-economic backgrounds, some populations are more at risk of experiencing violence because of things such as historic oppression, such as racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism. But there are populations that are more at risk of GBV than most others, which include women and girls, Indigenous persons, LGBTQ, and gender non-binary people, racialized people, those living in northern, rural, and remote communities, and persons with disabilities, sometimes newcomers to Canada, children, youth, and seniors. The intersection of any two of these risk factors can compound the person's risk. So as you can see, it's not just a small group of people. It can affect a lot of people.
Thanks, Rod. Is human trafficking a problem in Saskatchewan? Start with Tina.
Yes, it is a problem here in Saskatchewan, but it's also a problem across Canada. It is just a multi-billion-dollar industry that they're not going to stop. It's hard to get the resources to the girls that are being trafficked because they don't identify as being a victim themselves. They think that is their boyfriend or a girlfriend that they're doing this for. These girls they're just being exploited. and I'm sorry, it's hard to get a person to ask for help with that is being trafficked. So yes, it is a problem across Saskatchewan as well. The girls are also being recruited online, as I'm finding out in child exploitation. Girls are being lured through gaming platforms, they're being groomed that way. Then they're going onto other websites such as Seeking Arrangements, sugardaddies.com. So we're seeing a lot of trends that way from the girls in Saskatchewan, but it's also across Canada.
Haley?
I just wanted to add to Tina's piece that in terms of human trafficking in Saskatchewan, there is more efforts needing to come towards bringing awareness to what human trafficking is so that girls are able to identify when they are being trafficked, and not only identify when they are, but that there are supports, and that there is a way to exit that. And while it's complicated, those supports are growing both across Saskatchewan for our rural communities as well as urban communities and across Canada as well.
Is gender-based violence a problem in Saskatchewan? Joelle?
Yes, here in Saskatchewan, gender-based violence is a problem. We actually have one of the highest rates of gender-based violence in the provinces. Our rates are about double the national average. So we're looking at about 655 people per 100,000 who are victims of gender-based violence. That really accounts to us having 7 of the 10 vulnerable communities here in Saskatchewan, which are located in our northern areas. And like Rod had spoke to earlier, where we're dealing with Indigenous peoples, we're dealing with isolation, we're dealing with rural aspects where we are dealing with isolation, limited resources. So it's a little bit more difficult in our northern communities to get the supports there or to transport out. So we do see higher levels of gender-based violence in our northern communities.
Thanks, Joelle. Can the implied threat of real violence be enough to classify as gender-based violence, or must it be actual violence? Does the violence have to happen once to the victim, or at least once to make all of the following implied threats enough? Rod?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, can the implied threat of real violence be enough to classify as GBVH? In the eyes of the victim, yes. It's how that individual perceives what's happening to them. But something I want to say here is when we talk about GBV, sometimes people, when they say, well, I've been a victim of GBV, that really doesn't tell the story. And I think that's what people misunderstand. They need to tell the story for people to be able to understand what is actually happening to them. Because it's GBV, a title like that, or gender-based violence, is like that of child abuse or abuse of the elderly. They're a catch-all. That's an overarching thing. And because of the titles they have, they then lead us to do certain things possibly differently. With child abuse cases, because the children and dependent, there's certain things we have to do for them. When we talk about the abuse of the elderly, maybe there's a capacity issue or an immobility issue. So there are certain things we have to do. With GBV, because of the topic area that we're dealing with, there may be some different nuances how we have to address that individual. But just to say I'm a victim of GBV doesn't tell the story.
Thank you, Rod. What are common misconceptions about GBV And what can I do to educate myself? Rod?
Quickly, and this one, the common misconceptions. I think everybody, when they hear gender-based violence, thinks him and her. That's it. That's the main thing. Is that it's a two-way gender thing. And how can a person educate themselves? Do as much reading as possible on the issue. Speak to the organizations who are trying to address it, such as organizations like OUT and other organizations, to get a really good idea of what it really is, so that people aren't going down a path that really isn't giving a clear picture. Get to know the story, get to know what you're dealing with.
Jess or Connor, would you like to add something?
Yeah, absolutely. So to add on what Rod had said so beautifully, is a really big misconception is that, again, gender-based violence is typically framed as a women's issue, something that's impacting women and is being perpetuated by men. And while that is absolutely the case in many, many instances and needs to be addressed and given a platform to talk about, it's also wildly important to ensure that we are expanding that framework and our viewpoints to include other folks. So as mentioned, to us LGBTQ folks, gender diverse folks. I think there's this idea that, again, GBV shows up in only specific ways. And so an example that I can share with you all is Pink Shirt Day in school is about anti-bullying. And so folks are encouraged to wear a pink t-shirt to their school to say, we're against anti-bullying. What a lot of folks don't realize is that day is rooted in gender-based violence. A young boy wore a pink shirt to school, and because he was not performing his gender correctly by wearing a pink shirt, he experienced violence because of that. And so I think it's, again, really important for folks to realize that gender-based violence impacts everybody, and that because our society holds very rigid norms around what it means to be a man or a woman, and when people exist or behave or challenge or defy those norms, they often experience violence. Connor, take it away.
Yeah, and just to add to both Jess and Rod, there's a really lovely human by the name of Alok, who is a gender nonconforming, trans feminine individual who's a writer, performance artist, who said, pain doesn't have to be visible to be real, and violence doesn't have to be physical to be serious. And it just automatically makes me think of misgendering or using someone's wrong pronouns or incorrectly using a name that someone has already said they do not use anymore, whether it's purposely or it just doesn't seem like it's important for the person to continue doing. Those things are very harmful, and they accumulate and build up over time. And you get it from all over. You get it from talking to family or interactions with clients at work, going to the doctor, even going through the drive-through. And so just examples of how those, may seem just like a small thing, how they build up, and those small harms become really large harms and acts of violence, even if they're not physical or something that you can see. And as far as what you can do, Rod said it very, very nicely. Read everything you can. I would just add to that saying to learn about the history of 2S LGBTQ people in Canada and the impacts of colonization, learn about the harmful laws and policies, criminalizations, the mental illnesses, that how being queer was in the diagnostics for mental illnesses, and then just experiences of the 2S LGBTQ people to better understand why there might be some hesitations or fears, frustrations when engaging with certain services or supports that you think may be helpful, but don't seem like something that might where people just kind of see the potential harms that may come out of it. And then just like a quick Out Saskatoon plug, we do have many often free trainings. Our GBV workshop that Jess facilitates are free. And then we have a variety of other ones for in schools, for businesses and all of that. So feel free to take a look on our website.
Thank you, everyone. Next, we'll have Julie answer this question. Explain what gaslighting, catfishing, and ghosting is, and know how to be aware when this is happening and how to get out of the situation before something goes wrong.
Thanks, Trisha. So these three terms are all forms of emotional and verbal abuse. When we're talking about gaslighting, it's a form of psychological abuse where one person or sometimes a group uses it against someone else, and it makes them question their sanity, makes them question their perception of reality, and sometimes even their memories. And so people feel that experience gaslighting, they often feel confused, they get really anxious, and they're unable to even trust themselves or their own memories because of what's just happened to them. And the term gaslighting derives from the 1938 play, and then it was developed into a film called Gaslight. So people can always type that into Google and learn a little bit more about it and watch that film. And it's showing where a husband manipulates his wife into thinking that she has mental illnesses, and she starts questioning her sense of reality by him continually dimming their gaslit lamps. And he has other forms of manipulation in there. And so it really showcases what this term actually is. And gaslighting can be really difficult for people to recognize at first, because that person being the gaslighter, they tend to make the person that they're abusing to really doubt themselves and their whole grasp on reality, and they'll blame them. They'll tell them that, you know, you're being too sensitive, you're being irrational. And so it can be really difficult to pinpoint. So I have a few quick examples of what it might sound like or how you can recognize it. So some of the techniques that the abuser, the person gaslighting you, might use is countering. So they might say something like, "You never remember things accurately. Are you sure? You have a really bad memory. Maybe it didn't happen that way." Sometimes they'll do it through withholding. And so they'll refuse to engage in that conversation, and they'll brush it off, saying things like, "I don't know what you're talking about. You're just trying to confuse me," and just end the conversation. They might trivialize it by saying, "Well, you're making a big deal out of nothing." Sometimes it's through like the actual denial. So they're saying like, "Well, you're just making things up. That didn't actually even happen." And then diverting. That's just another crazy idea you got from your friends. And then there's also the stereotyping that can be used. And so we hear this, you know, it can be sometimes actually directed right towards your gender, when the abuser might tell the female, you know, "You're just acting irrational, you're just crazy, all females act like this is ridiculous." And so when you experience this, it's really important to know that if you suddenly start to question your own sense of reality, you're starting to feel like maybe you are going crazy, you're questioning your own memories, that's really normal because of the way the abuse happens. It's normal to feel confused, and it then also affects their ability to make simple decisions afterwards. If this is something that's going on, you could tend to become more withdrawn, maybe isolated, because you're really insecure about what's going to happen and how you perceive the situation. And it tends to leave people feeling hopeless and worthless. And it really affects their self-esteem and their sense of self-worth. So there are a few things you can do if you suspect that you're being gaslit. You can document the incident so that you're not just relying on your memory. So write it down in a journal, use the notes on your phone, especially if this is something that's happening at work. You can share the situation with a trusted friend or go to your counselor and discuss what happened in that situation so that you can get an outside perspective. And lots of times that helps you to identify what actually just happened. And it's always really helpful, if you do suspect that you're a victim of gaslighting, to seek professional help, because we're going to help you rebuild that self-esteem and that self-worth that you've been questioning because of the type of abuse. So there are some things that you can do in the moment to respond to someone who's gaslighting you. And if you can recognize that's what's happening, you can say things like, "We remember things differently. I know my truth and I'm not debating it with you." I hear you, but that isn't my experience. I'm stepping away from this conversation. And that not engaging in that lengthy debate that continually questions your memory or the situation that just happened. So gaslighting can be a little bit difficult. And so if you really are questioning it, it's always best to seek outside resources to help you out. So the next one is catfishing. So catfishing is the act of creating a false identity online in order to lure people into a form of relationship. So catfish refers to that person, that predator that is developing that false identity online. And catfishing is abusive and deceptive because that person is misportraying who they are. It oftentimes that person's online profile isn't real. They're pretending to be someone else. And this was really highlighted, and the term came out in the documentary where Nev Schulman had a whole documentary around his experience around this. And there's no good reason why people do catfishing. Sometimes they're just lonely. Sometimes they want to feel like boost their self-esteem. So they want to develop a persona that they think other people will accept more. And it sometimes involves scamming their victims for money, harassing them, or sometimes just to abuse them, not just, creating a profile that they think is going to be more acceptable. So there's some red flags that you can watch out for if you think that you're talking to someone who is catfishing you. So if this person has been contacting you and it's almost always online, and they won't ever pick up a phone call, and they won't show their face to you. So they're often saying things like, well, I can't actually pick up my phone or be in a video chat because my phone's broke, my camera's busted, I'm too shy, I don't want to, all that kind of stuff. It's really important to know, is this person actually really shy, or is this person who they say they are? Lots of times you can go through and look, in their profile, especially if they have a Facebook or Twitter account or, any of those social media platforms. If they don't have a lot of pictures of themselves or things that they go to, people post personalized things. So if the profile is really limited, are you actually talking to a person who says they are? If they don't have a lot of friends or they don't have a lot of followers, it seems really stark, like just really basic, you might not be talking to a real person. And then when you talk to them and their story just doesn't add up, right? So this can be things like they're, from a big city, they work for a big corporation, they're relocating to your small town. Would that corporation really be relocating to your small town? Is that actually a possibility, right? Looking for those things that just don't quite add up in their story. And then you can also see if they're using someone else's photos. So you can do a Google reverse image search and see if the photos actually match to someone else's Facebook profile or social media platforms to see if, they actually are lying and they've taken someone else's images and they're now portraying that they are that person. So if all their photos that they have in their social media platforms are only professional photos, and there's nothing personalized about them, and they can't send you any photos of activities they're participating in recently. They tell you, oh yeah, we just went camping for a couple of days, and they can't send you any photos of themselves doing something. Then you might not be talking to someone who is that real person. And if they ask you for money, that's a clear-cut sign that they're trying to exploit you in some way. It's never good to send anybody you just met money. So, if they're asking for a loan or a gift or, to help them out of a difficult situation and you've just met them, that's a huge red flag, and please don't do that. And some of the other small nuanced things are they over the top? Are they extremely romantic right away? Are they love bombing you? and you don't actually know anything about them, and they're just focused on you and how much they love you and care about you, even though you've never actually even met this person. That can be really important. And so then it's just trusting your gut feeling. So if something feels off and, you know, you're getting that like twinge feeling that something just isn't kind of, you know, adding up here, it probably isn't. It's probably too good to be true. And so do your own research, right? Do that reverse image search, search their messages online. So if they keep telling you a specific line or a quote, you can always search that and see if that is like a particular line that's used quite often, and protect yourself. Don't share too much. Don't give out your personal information and your location, things that can put you at risk. And then the last one is ghosting. So ghosting is when someone you're dating ends the relationship by cutting off all communication without any explanation. But this can also happen in friendships. It doesn't have to be in a romantic relationship, but that person just ends the relationship. There's just no communication, and you know, you're receiving nothing. They won't answer your phone calls. There's no replies to your texts. There's lots of psychological reasons why someone might ghost. It's often based in avoidance. They want to avoid the conflict. They have fear of that conflict, of actually saying something, you know, having that emotional intelligence enough to end the relationship, or, you know, whether it was romantic or a work relationship or a friendship. And so it's really important that if you're someone who's been ghosted, that you take the time to heal that relationship for you, because getting that closure that most people need in order to heal and move on from the relationship probably isn't going to happen no matter how many times you text or call them. So making sure that, you know, you focus on you, what do you need in order to heal? And there are some really basic things that you can do to kind of help that healing. You know, don't torture yourself by going over their old photos and saving their texts and, you know, trying to stalk them on social media. Giving yourself a break from them and recognizing that this says more about them than it does about you. This is more about their unhealthy communication skills than it is about anything to do with you. And yeah, so any of those, you can always, any of those terms, you can always pop into Google. There's lots of great articles written on them, but it's always really helpful that if you've experienced some of these, to seek some professional help to help rebuild that self-esteem and that self-worth. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Julie. And Julie, I'm going to have you answer the next question as well, please. What is the best way to prevent gender-based violence or any type of violence?
Yeah, so this is a really great question, and it's really big, actually. So what it comes down to, though, is that there's two main ways to prevent gender-based violence in a smaller way. So through education and through breaking the silence. So we know that this is a complex issue. It's multifaceted. It's, you know, it is really deeply entrenched in gender-based discrimination, social norms, acceptance of violence, even if it's just through language, jokes, all that kind of stuff, gender stereotypes, and then the laws and policies that have been enacted in our country. So prevention comes from addressing those structural causes at the core, and knowing that, you know, we can actually do something even if we're not the people who are in government. So we can, you know, we can become a social justice advocate. We can educate ourselves about what gender-based violence is, what stimulates it, you know, how do we experience it in our everyday lives? Do we ourselves hold gender-based biases? You know, we need to do that internal self-reflection to really look at how are we perpetuating, or are we allowing this to be perpetuated in our own lives? You know, so this can be, right, laughing at someone's joke that might be racist, laughing at someone's joke that might be sexist, right? And so really giving yourself that permission to become, you know, a social justice advocate. the education is really important. So early education, not only for our children, but for anybody who doesn't understand what gender-based violence is, learning respectful and healthy relationships. And then really working with boys and men, because we know that gender-based violence is a men's issue. And that's not to, just lay blame out there. We know the stats show that men, no matter, if it's in a heterosexual or within the LGBTQ plus community, that men are most often the perpetrators of the violence. So getting men to take this issue on, to take responsibility, to be the advocates, to change it for men, relearning new social norms, what's acceptable behavior, what's emotional intelligence, how can they be more respectful, how can they work at the root causes that are within themselves that bring about that violence. And then for us, we can educate ourselves. We're the first line of education. We can be that person that says, hey, like, that's actually not acceptable to say here. I don't appreciate that. We don't accept gender-based violence, within our organizations, within our homes, within our workplaces. And then we can use our voice, whether it's on social media, whether it's in social settings and groups that we're in, especially like in sports, all those places, we can be the person that advocates for that education to come in, that stands up and says, look, this isn't okay. We're not going to tolerate that here. And then also we can be the voice that goes forward to, write to our MLAs to advocate for social policy changes in our organizations, in our schools, in our communities. The more that we speak up, the less that the violence is tolerated. And so then it doesn't allow it to be perpetuated on an ongoing basis. So it's a two-part, right? That education, first of all, is really important, because if you don't know how it even starts or where it stems from, that is like the first step. So recognizing that gender inequalities lead to the development of those norms that can directly influence the attitudes and the beliefs which come out in language. And then we see that expression of violence from language all the way up into physical violence. So really starting with that education, and then how can you become a social justice advocate to help end it? Thanks.
Thanks, Julie. The next one will start with Haley. Why would anyone put up with violence? Do we just leave, or do we ignore it?
Thanks, Tricia. That's, again, a really broad question in terms of how do we start to address violence if we are a victim or a survivor. So one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that each individual's experience of violence is going to be unique to them. And the factors that exist within their lives and how they address that violence is also unique to them. They may have different intersecting points of oppression that make the concept of leaving, quote unquote, very, very difficult. There can be financial constraints. There can be familial pressures in terms of understanding what a family unit is supposed to look like. There are community and societal pressures that may also impact somebody's ability to leave. We also know that, especially in the instances of domestic violence, that domestic violence is a continuum and takes place over time. So it's not always a single physical assault in the way that we often think about domestic violence. My partner has assaulted me and now I have to leave. Domestic violence or gender-based violence is so much broader than that and incorporates the emotional, the verbal, the physical, financial, controlling abuse over often a very long period of time, to the point where a victim may not feel as though they deserve any better or that there is anything different or better out there for them. So we can't just bring it down to a simple, oh, if you've been abused, you leave. We also have to have resources that are available to that individual, that are accessible to them, and not just physically accessible. They have to feel emotionally safe for them as well. We have many competing factors for people that might impact their vision or what they believe to be a safe environment for them. In terms of ignoring it, often victims of violence are attempting to ignore it. They're attempting to downplay those things. They're trying to say that this isn't a big deal, that this is just the way things are. And and it gets to a point where they can no longer ignore it. But often that's been after a long period of violence, and things have escalated to a point where maybe their safety is at imminent risk as well. In terms of safety, we also know that at the point when an individual is going to leave a situation, especially of domestic violence, is also the point in time that they're at the most risk for the most significant assaults or threats to their safety. Rod, I'll hand that over to you.
Thanks, Haley. Just to give you a couple of examples to what Haley was just talking about, and over the years of working in this area, there have been a number of victims I've spoken to, and there was a group of victims who got together and they developed a video here in the province called How Then Shall We Live? And they were victims, they weren't actors, and they showed a really clear picture of why it wasn't quite as simple as just saying you should leave, or why are you going back? Do you enjoy it type thing? And those ladies, and they were all ladies, females, who some left after 4 months, some left after 4 years. And the comment was, at the time people tried to help us, we weren't ready to leave. And when we were ready to leave, we're glad people did try to help us in the past, because the information they provided to us was there when we needed it, when we were ready to move. The second side of that is people, and I've heard it from people at the front line say, oh, come on, this is the 17th time we've been round to this house. Why aren't they leaving? Well, can you imagine somebody working in a employment? When they first started the job, it was a great environment. They get a decent wage, the people were great in that, and then management changes and it becomes an abusive environment. They don't just walk away from work because they're getting a paycheck to put a roof over their head, clothes on the back, and food on the table. So what's different here? Again, it's not quite simple as just walking away. It started as a healthy relationship, a good relationship, and then all of a sudden things started to change. And I've heard victims say it's better to deal with the devil you know than the devil you don't know. Looking for those resources in some of these relationships over when the situation has been going on over a long period of time, they may not know where to go first to find those resources, to put food on the table, to put clothes on the back of the children, and to put a roof over their head. But once they've done that and they've got that plan in place, they then say, I'm out of here. Just like the person who's in an environment of employment where it's become abusive. They don't just walk away from it, but they go looking for another job. And when they find another job, they tell the one they're in, I don't have to put up with this anymore, and they leave. So it's just to give you an example that it's not a simple process for people just to walk away from these type of things.
Thanks, Rod. Next, is social media bullying considered a way of abuse? Haley?
Social media can absolutely be another method of abuse and gender-based violence. So we spoke to this a little bit earlier around the idea of attitudes. Social media can be a wonderful tool, and it can also be a very dangerous tool, especially when it comes to gender-based violence. Social media has been excellent in terms of forwarding some movements like our Me Too movement. Really took off because of the gift of social media and the ability to broadly share a message that individuals can really resonate and relate to. The flip side and the dangerous side of social media is that it's also a broad platform to share dangerous attitudes towards marginalized populations that can then also grow broadly and reach a really broad population, and can also really serve to further some existing thoughts or attitudes that individuals may have, because they're able to find another community that they can connect to that will perpetuate their beliefs or validate their beliefs, especially around violence against women. In terms of individuals, social media can be an absolute form of harassment. It can further stalking behaviors as well. So certainly is considered another way of abuse.
Thanks, Haley. And Joelle, why isn't gender-based violence treated more seriously with authorities?
Gender-based violence is treated very seriously by the authorities. These gender-based violence occurrences are very complex, dynamic occurrences that really do require a collaborative approach. The police are a piece of that puzzle, but there's a lot of pieces of puzzle that need to come together to help assist in these type of occurrences. We within the RCMP, we respond to these calls as priority calls. They are our number one call when they're coming in. We are responding to them. They come to the top of our list every single time. So we're constantly looking at a risk-focused investigation. So we're constantly assessing the risk to all of the parties that are involved in these occurrences, because it's not necessarily only the subject and the victim. There are children that are involved, others, maybe elderlies, parents that are living in the home. So we're always having to address this in a dynamic type approach. So we're utilizing, calling in resources, our government agencies, government partnerships, community partners, our victim services personnel, so that if resources are required right at the time, we're calling those people in and ensuring that before the police ever leave, that we've addressed any sort of safety concerns and any resources that may need to be in place in the interim until we can get permanent resources that are required when we look at our victims going forward, when they're looking to leave these type of violent situations. So we want to just ensure that that risk is always being reassessed and that we're always engaging with any of the services within the community that can assist these people, and we're reaching out and making those contacts for them. So that's like I said, it's just very dynamic. And my personal experience is that everybody who is working and responding to gender-based violence, they care. And that's what I want to leave here, is that reach out, because the police care and they want to help, and we do have resources in place to help.
Thanks, Joelle. Our next questions are going to be related to the stats, and we'll start with Joelle with the first question. Approximately how many people are victims in Canada a year?
So this is coming out of Stats Canada, which reports that about 310 per 100,000 people are victims of gender-based violence. As I had spoke to earlier, that is about double in Saskatchewan. So we're looking at about 655 people per 100,000 that are victims of gender-based violence.
And Joelle, how many women's shelters are available in Saskatchewan?
So we have two types of shelters available here in Saskatchewan. First off are our emergency shelters, which are open 24/7. They're for situations, times of crisis. Individuals entering these women's shelters can have the opportunity to stay between 4 to 6 weeks. They get their own bedrooms, rooms to accommodate kids, family rooms, and then there's common spaces for kitchen and such like that, but they try to be as accommodating as possible with what that facility has available, but you're always guaranteed that you do have a private room. So currently we have emergency shelters in Black Lake, Larange, Meadow Lake, Prince Albert, Melford, Lloydminster, North Battleford, Saskatoon, Yorkton, Fort Capel, and Regina. So I really encourage these shelters are open 24/7, and they're always available for a phone call for any type of support or questions that anybody that is dealing with gender-based violence may have. They're an excellent resource, and I highly recommend that if you do have questions or you are in crisis, that you do contact them. As well, there are second stage shelters. These are long-term stays. They can be up to 1 to 2 years. People can self-refer to these shelters. They're really social housing. So the people utilizing these type of shelters are still paying some sort of rent. So it's an assistance-based shelter. So we have 3 here in Saskatchewan. We have one in Prince Albert, one in Saskatchewan, and one in Regina. So I recommend that you go to PASS, that's the Provincial Association of Transition Houses of Saskatchewan, their website for any further information on the shelters. But like I said earlier, definitely feel free to contact them. They're there to support and answer any questions.
Thank you. Rod, how many men report partner abuse in Saskatchewan?
In answer to that, I'll just give you a piece up front. Because of the way over the years men have been brought up, sometimes men find it tough to actually tell other people that they have been or are being beaten by a member of the opposite sex. So there may be stats out there, but they may not really reflect the true picture. There is a piece of research that is being conducted across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba right now, and the report will be presented to the funding agency at the end of this month, beginning of May, before it goes public. But it is a piece of research as men as victims of IPV. So there is research being done to give some sort of picture to what is going on. And again, you've got this issue of gender identification with LGBTQ. Again, in relationships like that, I mean, if it's in a male-male relationship, you have that one party is male, one party may be abused. So again, it's making sure we get the right numbers for the right. I'm not a great fan necessarily always of stats, because what you get with regard in stats is those crimes that have been reported, not necessarily all the other stuff, the underneath of the iceberg. You don't always get that picture of what's going on beneath the water. So it's tough to actually speak to that.
Thanks, Rod. Joelle, how many male and females are sexually abused in 1 year around the world? Has this gone up since COVID?
Well, I cannot provide world statistics. I don't have those, but I can speak to Saskatchewan. And when I'm providing these statistics, these are based out of the RCMP. So they're not the whole of Saskatchewan. I don't have access to those stats as well. But so speaking on an increase in COVID-related complaints, if it's gone up. So what we're looking at, my stats are showing from March 2019 until February 2020. So the stats are, we had 828 reports of sexual assaults. From March 2020, so the start of COVID, until February 2021, we've had 770. Okay, so that's showing a decrease of 7% reports of sexual assaults to the RCMP. Now I'm with Rod on this one. I don't necessarily assume from those stats that we're not that there isn't sorry, I'm mumbling, but that the stats are actually going down, or maybe it's more that people aren't able to report them. So it's kind of a twofold thing. Is it good that they're decreasing? Absolutely. But is there a reason behind that decrease? Are people not having access because of quarantine and not being limited movement in reporting those sexual assaults? So it's kind of a twofold. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I mean, so you can kind of have to read between the lines on stats sometimes, but on the face of it, it does appear to be that they are not going up.
And Joelle, what is the male to female domestic violence ratio?
Well, again, like Rod spoke to, I think there are a lot of barriers to males reporting gender-based violence. So again, these are statistics. And the statistics say 79% of victims are women and girls. Therefore, 21% of victims are males. But again, we have those barriers in place to males reporting. So how accurate are the stats in relation to actually the gender-based violence that's going on? I think the stats are a little skewed when it comes to that.
Rod, can you tell us how many people in Saskatchewan are affected by this?
Every person in this province, every child, every person is affected by it. When we look to the group of folks that it affects, that's not only taking place in the home, it's taking place in the workplace, on the street, it's everywhere, in the schools. So it affects everybody. When we talk about between two parties in a home setting, if there are children there, it affects the children. If it's in a workplace, not only is it the client or the victim, but it's the other folks in that environment who not only are affected because the person who is being abused, their work is possibly suffering from it, and they're having to carry that individual, but their safety may also be at risk in that work environment. So from my way of thinking, everybody is affected, and this is why it is everybody's issue, because I don't care, and I usually speak to this on a regular basis, and I don't care who a person is, at some point in their life, every one of us will be affected by some form of violence, even if it's not on us, but we'll know somebody that has been affected by a violence, is aware of somebody, whether it be family, friend, or co-worker. It will affect us at some point in our life.
Joelle, can you touch on the statistics of female abusers versus male abusers?
So again, we're just playing off of the stat that I had provided earlier. So we're looking at 21% are female abusers, 79% are male abusers. But again, that barrier to reporting is there, it exists. So I do feel that there are a lot more male victims of gender-based violence than we actually know about, and that's because we're not seeing those reports.
Our next topic is going to be about the justice system, and we'll start with Rod. Can you tell us what Clare's Law and what Clare's Law is, and our RCMP supporting it?
Certainly, thanks for that. Clare's Law. Clare's Law came out of a situation that happened in Britain a number of years ago, where a young female who got into a relationship wasn't aware of her partner's previous violence towards other people. She had tried to get information because there was something that wasn't quite right with the relationship and wasn't able to access that. That young individual was killed in that situation, and her father fought for many years to bring it about. Saskatchewan's the first province in Canada to bring about Clare's Law. That's not the actual name of the act, but we still will call it Clare's Law. And the RCMP are supporting it. So it's both municipal and RCMP that support Clare's Law. To give you a bit of a background, this is where you have a situation where you have an individual who has a perceived notion that they may be at risk of injury to themselves. It hasn't happened, but there's something has triggered them to think they need to check out this relationship. So they themselves can go to the police and ask to make an application to qualify whether the feelings are correct or not. I'm not going to get into all the details because it's quite a long process. We spent probably 2 hours yesterday, Joelle, speaking with our police-based victim services folks. But what it comes down to is the person themselves can make an application at the front desk of the police station or the counter at the detachment office. There is a process the police go through. But to talk about it is sometimes where the public have a right to know, where the person making the application has a right to know And sometimes police may be involved in some situations where they come across an individual's name coming up, where there's some indication that that person's life may be at risk. Then that is the need to know, where the police then notify that individual. But there is a whole process for it. There is once that's decided, if there is need to be a disclosure as to the type of risk this person may be going through, they will meet with that individual together with support staff to walk the individual through the disclosure. Part of the thing with Clare's Law, it isn't a way of finding out all the information, and all the information is given to that person. What they will receive is what risk they are at. And no police agency in this province is going to tell them that they're not at risk, because we're all at risk. Whether we apply for something like that, we're all at risk at some point. We could be walking down the street and something happens, we just don't know. So they'll either be low risk, medium risk, or high risk, based on what they've come across. And then they will provide information as to how to address that risk together with support staff, be it from the shelters, be it victim services. They'll do safety planning. There's a whole bunch of things they can do. Since August last year, when the legislation was passed, there have been actually 9 applications, not inquiries, applications. There's maybe lots of inquiries about it. And some of the inquiries are quite interesting when you have somebody maybe in a shelter or at a crisis center, or they're coming in with a bloodied nose or a broken arm because the partner's beaten them, and they're asking, am I at risk? They already know the answer because of what the circumstances they're in. So again, when people are inquiring about it is one thing, people who are making applications is another. So there's only been 9, but they have gone through the process and they have been notified and are very satisfied with what was given to them. There's a whole confidentiality issue to it as well. When they get that information, they sign a confidentiality agreement, because we, under the privacy legislation, we don't want people walking away from there and then going on social media and saying, oh, Johnny is the worst thing since sliced bread, and telling the whole world, because he may not be, but that's the way the person perceives them. So there's a whole bunch of different things that are put in place, not only to protect the victim, but to make sure that anything that is made available to them isn't broadcast to every Tom, Dick, and Harry. Joelle?
Thanks, Rod. Yeah, just to add to that is that we do in the RCMP, we're 100% support Clare's Law, and we are actively participating in Clare's Law, taking applications at our detachments. We were a little delayed in our participation due to the fact that we are a federal entity, and we had a bit of a hang up with Section 8 of the Privacy Act. So we had to look at getting a regulatory change made in order for us to be able to release that risk-based information. So we do have that regulation changed and amended so that we can participate. So if you've heard previously that the RCMP was not taking Clare's Law complaints, we are actively since April 30th taking Clare's Law complaints.
Thank you. Now we'll ask Wade. Wade, who lays the domestic assault charge?
Thank you for the question. The answer in short is the police. Frequently what we hear, you'll hear people say, well, I had this person charged or something to that nature, and I blame American television on that. Or you'll hear them say, I'm not pressing any charges. In fact, that's not the truth, and that's not how it works. What happens is that the police investigate, and based on the evidence they obtain, they may lay a criminal charge. That evidence can usually be in the form of statements from witnesses or a complainant. Sometimes, on rare occasions, it's physical evidence. For example, the most common type would be physical evidence of injury. Sometimes it can include forensic evidence as well. But the short answer is it is always the police that are in charge of the investigation and charging phase.
Thanks, Wade. Joelle, is there a place to report violent offenses towards someone if we notice it happening?
Yeah, absolutely. If you notice any sort of violent offense happening, you report to 911 immediately so that we can attend to stop the violence. That's our priority function as the police. So 911 would be your call in that case. If it's something that is not happening, is not currently in progress, but is still something that needs to be reported, we do have a telephone line of 310 RCMP, which gets you in contact wherever you are in Saskatchewan with your local RCMP detachment to make that report. As well, it's as easy as attending to any one of our detachments or any municipal police force and going ahead and reporting that crime.
And Joelle, is gender-based violence a criminal act? And who do we report it to?
Well, there are aspects of gender-based violence that are criminal. We recognize gender-based violence as being physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and financial abuse. And not within all of those areas of abuse does the criminal code apply. Obviously, in physical abuse, that's anything slapping, punching, hitting, cutting, all the way up to murder. So within the criminal code, we have assault, common assaults, assault causing bodily harm, assault with a weapon, aggravated assault, assault by strangulation, and of course our murder charges. So we would, anything physical, we're going to deal with that with the criminal code. Sexual offenses, again, those are criminal. So we are going to deal with any sort of sexual reports. We can utilize the criminal code for that. Abuse, so there are some actions within emotional abuse that are also criminal. So when we're looking at threats, so verbal threats, threats to cause harm to property, threats to cause death, those are criminal code offenses that we can proceed by, called uttering threats. As well, if on emotional abuse, a lot of times you'll see like damage to property, hurting pets, that type of actions. Now those are criminal as well, and we can proceed by mischief charges, whether it be mischief under 5,000 or mischief over 5,000, but we can proceed with the criminal code on those type of emotional abuse situations. As well as criminal harassment under emotional abuse. So that's like your stalking, where somebody is always around, they're always showing up, they're following you around, constant text message, emails, phone calls, anything that's unwanted, and it's continuing over and over again after you're asking them to stop, that we can proceed with a criminal harassment charge in that case. Financial abuse, so that's like withholding monies, taking monies without permission. Now we'd have to get all of the information. There is a potential to possibly proceed by theft charge based on how those funds are held and allocated. But those are some logistical things we'd have to investigate to determine if we can proceed criminally. So things like yelling, put down, name calling, like type of coercive behavior, those don't fall within the criminal code. But we do respond to those calls, we do address those calls and ensure that those people experiencing those type of behaviors are receiving resources and supports to help them make a decision about the relationship.
Thanks,
And
Joelle.
if I can, Tricia, just speak to the question there about gender-based violence, a criminal act, and we talked about the various areas it covers. something to keep in mind that what we're talking about isn't just to a certain age group. This can happen in young children all the way to seniors. When we look at seniors, there's things such as theft by power of attorney, when people have an authority over a senior, where you have somebody who has under laws that duty to provide the care to an individual. So they may be charged with failing to provide the necessities of life. I mean, so we'll look at, there are other criminal charges depending on, as I said before, what is the story? So we know what the picture is to be able to put the right pieces together, depending on what the situation is.
Thanks, Rod. Wade, can you touch on what are some of the long-term consequences of violence against women and girls?
Yeah, from my experience, it's the repetition through the generations. What ends up happening is that a lot of females will make poor choices with respect to partners, and a lot of the males are, and I don't want to reduce it to males and females, but that's the majority of it, will often recycle that violence that they see when they're young. You would think on its face that somebody would witness that violence and say, oh, I'm never going to do that to my partner. But in fact, it recycles over and over and over again. And I remember before I was a prosecutor, I was a legal aid lawyer, and I represented 4 generations of the same family in one court appearance, all on assault and violent related offenses. So it's something that that will repeat over and over again until that cycle is broken. And the only way that can happen is for victims to come forward, provide statements, and follow through with their complaint. And frequently what I end up getting is they may make a statement, many won't. They may make a statement, but then the day or two later or a week later, they're calling me up saying, I want to recant it, or it didn't happen that way. And we have a real tough time prosecuting those offenses because our case becomes severely weakened.
And Wade, does gender-based violence ever get prosecuted in Saskatchewan?
The short answer to that question is we'll prosecute anything if we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and it falls within the criminal sphere. The justice in this sense is blind. It doesn't, and it's that way for a reason, and so it's to not contribute to any biases, even subconscious ones. The short answer is yes, we'll prosecute it as long as we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and that means evidence. And one thing about evidence is sometimes the evidence is very cold comfort. It can leave you cold. So we don't deliberately prosecute any specific gender or ethnicity group or anything of that nature, but this is something we can prosecute if we have the evidence.
Thanks, Wade. Our next section is going to touch on awareness, and we'll start with Haley. The question that we received is how to identify warning signs. How do you leave? How familiar type violence will affect kids and babies, and how to protect them. Who does one trust and who should you not trust? How to know who to turn to, how to break the learned cycle. Can you trust a person that says they are not like so-and-so? Haley?
So it's a really complex question, and I want to kind of broadly break it down into 3 sections. So first and foremost, anytime an individual is at immediate risk or there is an immediate danger, they can call 911. Doesn't matter where you are in this province, that if there's an immediate risk or danger to your safety and your well-being or to that of your children, then we need to call for immediate intervention and authorities, and that's best served through 911. So those immediate needs can be protected. There are lots of different ways, and different things that quote unquote leaving can look like for an individual can really depend on where they are geographically. It can depend on what their financial situation is. It can depend on their social supports and the access to other resources that may exist for them within their specific location. I would really encourage anybody looking for information about leaving a gender-based violence situation or domestic violence situation to visit the PATHS website, where all of that information is really broadly laid out for you about what resources exist where, how to go about accessing them. And there's also a really handy quick exit option. So if you're looking at those resources and you're concerned about your internet history or somebody's seen that, we can use that safety tool that exists on that one single website that gives you accurate, relevant, timely information about what exists where you are in Saskatchewan. To speak to the section about familial violence and its impact on children. So we do know through research that children are impacted by domestic violence in the home, and they're impacted in the same way by seeing or hearing violence as if the violence had occurred to them. In Saskatchewan, part of our Child and Family Services Act is that domestic violence and witnessing ongoing domestic violence in the home is considered an area where child protection may get involved due to the risk to the children. The risk can be long-term to them, both for their own physical safety in the home where domestic violence is happening, but also for their mental and emotional safety as well. So domestic violence does have a long-term consequence for children. We also know that children who grow up in a home where there is domestic violence are more likely to engage in relationships down the road where interpersonal violence is also present, whether they become a victim of abuse themselves or they potentially become an abuser. So again, for children, domestic violence is a significant concern. Often when we're working with victims, they'll always say, I do everything I can to protect my children. And we really believe that we are, but we have to understand that when violence is in the home, even if they may not be subject to, say, a physical assault, those children are being deeply impacted and there is significant risk to them. The third part about that question about how do we learn, who do we trust, and how do we know if somebody is different than they say they were, or if we've had some issues in that relationship around domestic violence previously, how do we know if they've changed? And those are going to be so unique to each individual. And that's where access to appropriate supports and services with somebody who has experience and expertise in working with gender-based violence and domestic violence is really important. That story is going to be unique to you, and your story can be told in a safe space with a professional who can help you work through some of those impacts psychologically, emotionally, mentally, so that you can develop some skills so that we can start to interrupt that cycle of violence, not only for yourself, but perhaps for your family, for your community, and also for your children.
Thanks, Haley. And Haley, can we recognize gender-based violence? And how can we recognize gender-based violence, and how do we present on gender-based violence?
Sure. So when we talk about recognizing gender-based violence happens along a continuum. One of those spots that we can start is by identifying attitudes and the societal norms that are around us and begin to challenge those. So when we are in spaces where jokes that are sexist or racist or ableist or homophobic or transphobic are being told, those are some indicators of gender-based violence that's around us. We need to begin to challenge those. When we're talking more specifically about abuse, we can recognize that through controlled behaviors, manipulated behaviors, isolating behaviors, all of those little pieces that start to tell us, this person has shifted in their typical behaviors, and maybe I'm not seeing that person as much anymore. Maybe I'm starting to recognize indicators of injury to them. Maybe they're being secretive. Why has my communication changed with them? So all of those pieces that tell us something is a little bit different can be really good indicators that something is happening around gender-based violence. Rod spoke to it earlier about the importance around education and taking the time to access good resources to really understand what does gender-based violence look like in Canada? What does it look like in Saskatchewan? What does it look like in your community? What does gender-based violence look like for different populations? Because our experience of gender-based violence comes with our own framework and our own frame of reference, and is not going to be the same for other people, especially if they have other points of oppression or risk factors that don't necessarily impact us personally. So that piece around education is really, really vital. And we have to look at it both historically and how we've got to where we are, as well as what are some of our current trends. Whenever we're preparing to present on gender-based violence, that research and education is absolutely vital. It's important that we're working with the most recent available data to us. Census Canada is a great example of some of that data that is kept up to date fairly regularly. And it's important that we're also drawing information, resources, and data from relevant, well-researched databases, whether that be a provincial organization like PATHS, whether that be Census Canada, whether that be from our government of Saskatchewan. We also need to be mindful when we're presenting on gender-based violence about the potential to trigger our audience. So ensuring that we have some relevant supports around and we know where we can refer people onto if there is a disclosure of perhaps something that's happening in somebody's life. It's really important that if we're going to open the door to the conversation, we do so with respect to the lived experiences of everybody who may be in the room, and also ensure that we're applying a really broad lens so that we can do our best to ensure that everybody who may be in that space feels as though they're welcome to that space and their experiences are validated. So for me personally, it's extremely important that I consider the viewpoints or the experiences from populations that are not necessarily reflected in myself. And I do the research to make sure I have a good understanding of what gender-based violence may look like for a woman who's a new Canadian, somebody who is gender fluid, all of those different pieces, so that I can ensure that their experiences have space within that conversation. And I'm also willing to learn from those participants.
And Haley, what are you doing to stop it?
Stopping gender-based violence is, it's an ongoing and long-term societal movement that has to happen. To speak broadly within Saskatchewan, we do have 3 provincial organizations that represent many of the other smaller direct service providers in moving things forward, like awareness, prevention, the availability of interventions, and then ongoing supports long term. So when we talk about those 3 kind of bigger umbrella organizations, we're talking about PATHS, so Provincial Association of Transition Houses and Support Services, which really looks at the domestic violence lens. We have Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan, which is particularly focused on sexualized violence. And then we also have our broad Stops to Violence, which is our provincial umbrella organization that looks at all forms of violence. So those 3 big organizations kind of pull together that work for this province to build awareness campaigns, to look at data, to look at best practices and trends, and how those can be rolled out broadly across the province, so that we're sharing a consistent message around education, so that we have broad and accessible preventative programs, so that we have more interventions and supports at a point of an emergency, as well as we have those longer term ongoing follow-up pieces for people who have maybe moved past that point of needing an emergency intervention, but are requiring those long-term follow-up services for safe reintegration into their communities. I did want to pass over to Rod if there was anything specific you wanted to add around the Ministry of Justice and the work in gender-based violence.
No, I think you pretty well covered it there, Haley. And the other thing is that there was a public awareness campaign kicked off a couple of months ago throughout the province, which took a while to get there, but there's always that stuff in the background that's always going on to get there. But it's there now, and it's been quite effective, and a lot of people commenting on it. They were glad to see it. So there are ways to address it by getting it out there, getting people seeing it, becoming aware of it, and what they can do about it. And the captions are very good as well, you know, because one of them, excuses don't, I forget how it goes, excuses don't, are only the beginning, you know, something like that. I forget what it is now, but there is quite a bit of work going on with the interministerial committees throughout government regarding that.
Our next section we're going to talk about is the different supports and resources that we have. Jenna, can you explain what do victim services do when GBV violence happens?
Thanks, Tricia. So police-based victim services programs throughout Saskatchewan work in partnership with either an RCMP or city police, municipal policing. And most of the programs that work with the RCMP are on call with them 24/7 on a 24/7 basis. And we provide that crisis response. We aren't counselors. We are there to help them during their crisis and do 4 core services to get them onto their healing journey. We provide information first of where if there's investigation going on, we liaison with the RCMP. Once there's a charge laid, we explain what the next step is. We provide support through the entire process, and that could go on for a few weeks, months, years, forever. Whenever they want to be with us and we provide that support, we're going to be there for them. Because we aren't counselors, we do refer to programs that can provide that more in-depth support for them. Some of them are on the call with us today, so we do a lot of referrals to mental health, NEOS, partners, programs like Partners. Within our region here, we have a lot of resources and we have resource binders. So anybody that is looking for those supports, we make sure that we're providing them all to them so they know what is available to them. And the last thing that we do is advocacy. So we want to be a voice for them when they aren't being heard. And if we aren't doing all 4 of those services, we aren't doing our job correctly. If I'm not giving them the information, and then I'm not supporting them. If I'm not supporting them correctly, I'm probably not giving them the correct referrals. And overall, I'm not advocating for that client. So we want to make sure that we meet our clients where they're at and allow them to tell their story. That's been a theme throughout our whole panel, is to allow them to tell their story and to get the supports that they deserve, because they do deserve support and we have to meet them where they're at. I can't make them go to any referrals that I send. I want them to take ownership for that and make those steps on their own, so we can empower them to take those steps. So that's a little bit about what victim services does when gender-based violence happens. We work with all of them. It is a proactive referral with the RCMP that they, even if the client does decline to talk to victim services, we do follow up with them, make sure that they're doing okay, and to allow them to know that we're here for them. A lot of our files, if they do decline, they do change their mind once it hits the court system, and we provide them with that information on the justice system. But that's a little overview of us. Thank you, Tricia, for the question.
Thanks, Jenna. Now, Julie, what supports are available in rural areas? Where would a woman seek help immediately in the event of violence is taking place in her home?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So first and foremost, if you're in immediate danger and the violence is happening in that moment, the best course of action is always to dial 911. The police are always the first responders to any form of violence in that moment, and they will help you to transition out of that home and to, get you to a safe place or remove the person that is being violent in that moment. So that's always the first place to go. So there's also other places. So if you're experiencing abuse and you need support and resources in order to plan to get out, there are many options that people don't realize that are available to them. So in the Northeast, obviously there's Northeast Outreach and Support Services, often referred to as NEOS. So we cover the Northeast of Saskatchewan, and our resources provide a 24-hour crisis line that anyone in the province can call. And through that crisis line, we can also assist them in finding, what's the closest shelter to them, or, develop a safety plan with them and help them to plan to get out of that situation and, provide the referrals. Maybe they need information on how to find, a safety plan link, other shelters, other resources in their area. And NEOS can help you do that. So we also operate the women's shelter in Melfort. And then we have our outreach team that provides counseling and crisis intervention assistance. But if you live outside the Northeast area, so there's lots of people who live, farther north in rural, remote areas, a great way to find the closest shelter to you is if you have access to the internet on your phone, you can always use 211 on the internet and just type in shelters. It'll give you an entire list. You can use the websites like PAS that have already been mentioned, or you can always phone the Healthline 811. So that's, answered by healthcare staff who are able to, provide the same type of assistance, or any of those crisis lines. So whether it's the NEOS crisis line, whether it's even the kids help phone, those resources will help you to connect what's the closest resource to where you are. So it's always important to remember that the RCMP are there to help assist you to leave the property in a safe manner if you feel like you cannot get out safely without there being a conflict. So you can always request their help. And a lot of people fail to remember that you can contact your social service office for assistance in helping to, make a plan to get out and safety plan, especially if you have children who are involved and are experiencing the domestic violence with you. So that can be another great resource. So you can always contact them, and you can contact your local social services office during, their main office hours. But we also know that there's a mobile crisis units out of Prince Albert, Saskatoon, and Regina. So you can always contact one of those. And it's really important to know that whenever you're experiencing violence, it's best to get to a safe place, wherever that is. So if that means, you're in a rural area and, you can get to the local RCMP station, to a hospital, your local health clinic, it might even be your local church, somewhere safe that you can get the help that you need. And then other resources, do you have family or friends who could come and pick you up and help you get out safely without endangering anyone? Maybe it's, we're going to go for coffee, or, we're going to go for a visit, whatever. And, your parents are going to come pick you up, or your aunt, maybe it's your next door neighbor that you go to and you use their phone in order to phone 911. But recognizing that no matter where you are in the province, if you're in immediate danger, call 911 first. And then there's a whole other list of resources. So if anybody needs that help, they can always phone our crisis line. It's 1-800-611-6349, and our staff can help you out in doing the safety plan, accessing the resources closest to you, and helping you out with whatever you need in that moment.
Thanks, Julie. Jenna, can you tell us what kind of services are available in this area I reside?
Thank you, Tricia. So I think Julie's done a really good job of focusing on the Northeast. This question was from an individual in our area. So I think I'm going to focus more on that. If anybody would like to know what's available in your communities, you can go to all the resources that Julie's already listed, 211. But if you're having trouble making those calls on your own, you can always reach out to your police-based victim services programs. We will do those referrals for you, so you don't have to make those calls on your own. But I think Julie's done a really good job of highlighting what's available, so I'm not going to go over it again. Just wanted to say that there is always someone to help you make those calls if you are nervous or scared or not sure how to make those calls for yourself.
Thanks, Jenna. Julie, what options are available to women with teenage sons that need a shelter but can't get in if their son is with them? Some young teenage guys can be a trigger for some women.
Yeah, so I answered this one specifically towards NEOS because obviously I can't speak for the other shelters throughout Saskatchewan, but within NEOS, our shelter accepts women with teenage sons. So we've not had to look for other options because our policy says that there's no stipulations on the maximum age of dependent children, regardless of their gender. And we assess each case individually. So we look at what is the dependency on the mother. It's okay, like if their son is 16, 17, 18, but they're really dependent on their mom and they still need to be with her, we need to take that into account. And we also need to assess the safety and the well-being of our other clients in our shelter. So our shelter manager, Alana Cooley, she does a really great job of operating our shelter. She's able to discover really innovative ways to manage those difficult situations and work with the clients to find a solution. So we haven't run into this issue as of yet. However, there are some other resources that we might be able to reach out to. You know, this might be reaching out to social services and saying, you know, this mom and her child need a safe place to stay. We need, you know, some emergency funding or, you know, some assistance from you to help us find a good solution here in order to then protect the other client who might be triggered by seeing someone that is similar, you know, to their own abuser.
Thanks, Julie. And we'll start with Haley. What supports are available for human trafficking victims in rural communities?
Thanks, Tricia. So in terms of supports in rural communities for victims of human trafficking, they can be fairly broad in terms of the same supports that Julie has spoken to in kind of the rural area where we kind of cross over and both work around interpersonal violence are available. For our organization specifically, we are just in the process of launching a new program specific to supports for women who have been victims of human trafficking in terms of sexual practices. So there is now in this area a dedicated team who respond to those calls of crisis to work specifically with those women around the unique challenges and the unique circumstances that may have brought them to be trafficked, and as well as the unique challenges of helping them exit from being trafficked and reintegrate with their unique communities. There is also some specific programming in terms of closest geographically to us in Saskatoon through Hope Restored, where there's also a residential program for women who have been trafficked, as well as their children, to reestablish themselves, get access to specific counseling, as well as be in that kind of safe residential environment. In terms of supports for trafficking, you know, more broadly across Saskatchewan, it is an area that we are continuing to grow in, and we're recognizing that there needs to be more specific and tailored supports for those victims. Regardless of where an individual may be, a rural community, if they're very remote, we can always get in touch with the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline as well. Regardless of where you are, you can let them know on the other end of that 1-800 number, and they'll be able to directly connect you to the most relevant service that's closest to you. And that is operated 24/7, regardless of where you might be.
Thanks, Haley. Tina, do you have anything to add to that?
No, Haley and Julie both covered all of the excellent resources that we have in the province. And Haley spoke about my passion now, which is the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline. They also have online resources where the victim can go online, and there's a quick exit as well on the online website that they have there. And it will also give the resources online as well. But they their phone number is 1-833-900-1010, and they are there 24/7. I have called them and I have used them. So they have great partnerships with WestJet, Air Canada. If the victim needs to get back home to where she's from, they're very accommodating. That's all.
Thanks, Tina. And Julie, where and how can men find support for violence and abuse from their spouses or partners?
So NEOS provides outreach supports to any person, regardless of their gender, who experiences domestic violence and sexualized violence, past or present. So everyone in the Northeast can access our outreach services free of charge, and it doesn't matter of your gender. And so this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because unfortunately there's no specific men's shelters for those that are dedicated towards men who have experienced violence. And this is a really needed resource in Saskatchewan and I think across Canada. Men usually have to access homeless shelters such as the YMCA, you know, or other shelters that are provided through local organizations that are located in usually the bigger centers. There isn't a lot of them located in the smaller centers, but there is a lot of resources throughout the province that offer support for male victims. So again, men can always request assistance for the RCMP in the moment that they're experiencing that violence, and they can request assistance from social services, especially if they have children. Doesn't matter if their partner's a male or female or, you know, gender fluid. And they can request services if it's after hours through mobile crisis units and other local organizations that are closer to them. Those resources, again, you know, they can access them on 211. They can phone crisis lines such as the NEOS crisis line. But most organizations that deal with domestic violence don't discriminate. And so it's really important that we recognize that men are victims and that they need the services just as much as anyone else does. And so really being able to connect them to counseling, to social services, you know, if they need financial help or they need help, you know, finding housing, all that kind of stuff, men can access the same resources. Unfortunately, it's the shelters that are limited.
Thanks, Julie.
Tricia, if I could just speak to that, something to keep in mind, and this is where it comes back to education. Again, if we're providing safe facilities for women and girls who may have children to move away from a negative relationship where there is violence and abuse, it's educating the people who are at the front line to think about outside the box. That it's not about the gender, it's about the situation. If there are children involved and I think somebody mentioned when we've got a male-male relationship and they've got children in that relationship, if the shelter's full, sometimes they put people up in hotels, especially when there are children. So again, it's thinking outside that box and not just thinking about the gender. Look at the situation.
Thank you. Our next section that we're going to have Joelle talk on is the COVID-19 effects. We have two questions. The first one is, I used to run programming around sexual violence for university students in Vancouver. So this is definitely a passion area for me. My question I would like to submit is, has there been an increase in the amount of gender-based violence being reported during COVID lockdowns? Joelle?
Well, the short answer is yes, we have seen an increase in gender-based violence being reported to police. In Saskatchewan through the RCMP. In 2019, we received 6,914 calls for service. In 2020, we've received 7,803 calls for service. So we're seeing an increase of approximately 12% in gender-based violence calls. And I mean, in these type of situations, these victims' home is not necessarily their safe place. So that's where we're seeing the increases when we're locking people down, limiting movement. People are together with these potentially violent members, their family members, for a longer duration of time, especially substance abuse, increased substance abuse, aggravating mental health issues. A lot happens when during this time of COVID that we do see the increases coming out currently.
And Joelle, do you think this global pandemic will increase or decrease gender-based violence?
Well, as I just spoke to you, we are seeing an increase. Obviously, we're just very early into 2021. As we are collecting stats, we are seeing a decrease. So there is a projected decrease going into 2020. Whether that comes to be the case, time will tell. But I think now that we're seeing vaccines coming out, that we're going to be able to start allowing people some more movements, some more freedoms, going back to work, hopefully soon, those are all factors that are going to affect those numbers. So it's really a time game. So we're going to have to see how the pandemic develops and in relation to how we're going to see our gender-based violence calls change, hopefully for the better. As I said, hopefully we are going to get to start doing a little bit more movement, and people are going to be able to go back to work and get out of the home in cases where that's not their safe place.
Thanks, Joelle. Our next section we're going to discuss is gender, and we're going to have Jess and Connor take turns answering. Our first question we have is, does gender violence include the 2SLGB2Q community?
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at that one. Also gonna merge in who's most impacted into this one. So short, yes, it definitely does include the 2SLGBTQ plus community. GBV impacts everyone. It does not discriminate. It unfortunately can be a universal experience. Who it does impact the most within our community are trans women of color. They are disproportionately murdered at alarming rates. And within Canada alone, if you, there was a Trans Pulse Canada did this really wonderful survey for Canadians and showed that like racialized trans and non-binary people were just facing increased violence at like alarming rates, and most of the respondents were more likely to mistrust the police than white trans people. So even experiencing things on a systemic level. And then I would also say that gender diverse folks, so folks who are transgender, non-binary, two-spirit, gender fluid, or creative, I would say that they are impacted quite a bit as well and often left out of the statistics and the conversations. So that harm, that causes harm alone being excluded from the conversations. But we don't have any like numbers or statistics on it because they are often left out of it. So it's one of those things that you have to kind of just imagine that those things are there. Even within these conversations that we're having today, a lot of the questions that were asked by the audience and by individuals, I mean, this is the things that people have the understanding of gender-based violence, are thinking it's very binary within female, male, or like a, as some folks had said, you know, that it's like a men's issue, or like a woman versus man kind of thing, and that completely leaves out people who identify either outside of the binary completely or along the lines of there, as well as like our two-spirit, our indigenous queer folks, or indigiqueer, some folks are coming on with. It excludes them completely from the conversations, and the harm from there is violence as well. Jess?
Yeah, and to add another wonderful quote by Alok, at a fundamental level, we are still having to argue for the very ability to exist. So how are you supposed to be believed about the harm that you experience when people don't even believe you exist? So as Connor was pointing out, you know, when statistics don't actually gather information about all populations, when you know, services are set up to serve just men and women, again, as we know, this is a huge problem, and these groups of people absolutely deserve, you know, supports and resources, but so do all the other folks. And so who is most impacted, just to continue on with that? Yeah, we have trans women of color, gender diverse folks, and then also women who are attracted to more than one gender, so bisexual or pansexual, what have you. And there's a lot of challenges with coming forward when a person is part of the queer, trans, or two-spirit community. Part of the GBV project, we did a lot of interviews with folks And one interview that we heard from a lesbian woman was that when she tried to report the violence that she experienced, her response, or the response she received, was, well, your girlfriend, how much damage could she really do? She's just a tiny little woman, right? Why didn't you just push her off? Why it doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. And so there's often these issues of being dismissed or invalidated, or this idea again that everything in the queer community is all happy and rainbows, when in all actuality there is a lot of lateral violence happening within the queer community and violence happening from without the community internally. So yeah, and to answer, queer couples experience equal or higher levels of gender-based violence in their intimate partner relationships, and that can be due to internalizing messages of homophobia and transphobia, internalizing that hate of I'm wrong, I'm sinful, there's something wrong with me, there's something that's not natural about me. And then if that internal hate exists, being able to perpetuate that across a relationship. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Next question we have is, what makes a person switch their gender as they get older? I have a cousin that their son switched when he was in his early 20s.
Number one, congratulations to your cousin. That is fantastic, and really happy that he felt safe enough to just say, hey world, I know you thought I was like this, but actually this is who I really am. So that's beautiful. The reason why many folks may not come out until later in life about their gender, about who they're attracted to, many aspects of who you are as a person, we need to consider the environment and the context in which we live. When we look at social norms and laws and policies, you know, it hasn't been all that long that same-gender marriage was legalized in Canada. That only happened in 2005. It's only been a few years that gender identity and expression have been protected under human rights laws. So the fact that our society is becoming more and more aware that diversity exists outside of the binary of man and woman, outside of the binary of being straight or gay, we know that people are diverse and exist on a spectrum. So I think this idea that being trans is trendy, it's actually, now that we're starting to talk about it more, and it's being more normalized and accepted, and people are understanding the diversity of the human experience, we're starting to talk about it more. And when people have language that describes their experiences, they're better able to identify with it and go, oh, that's what's going on. I thought I was the only one, or I didn't realize other people felt this way. So because we're normalizing these conversations and we're talking about it, people are better able to say, oh, that actually rings true for me as well. Yeah, Connor, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to add, when people feel comfortable and safe to explore or question their identities and their sexuality, they're more likely to come out. So having that safe space to begin with. So as Jess was saying, like, congratulations to your cousin, because your cousin probably made it a safe enough space for their child to even explore those things. And moreover, I think that early 20s is kind of a nice time to come out. You know, you're done with your teens, and you may have already, you know, some folks, they may already have some inclinations that they might be trans or something, but they don't, as Jess was saying, they don't have that language or something to support and define themselves as trans. I often tell people that, like, labels are really great for finding community, but labels can also be something that you can kind of shed off as you're growing and more comfortable within yourself. And so it's a matter of having the language and knowing that that's even a possibility, because most teens don't know that it's a possibility or know that it's something that they can do. And so whether someone comes out early in life, like we're hearing a lot more stories of accepting parents and parents who are working with their kids and hearing that their kids are being insistent and persistent and consistent in saying, no, this is not my gender, and that they are working with them. Or if you're coming out later in life, I've met several trans individuals who have come out in their 50s and 60s. It doesn't invalidate your identity regardless if you're coming out super early, super what we considered late, or anywhere in between. And in fact, like myself as a transgender man, this was very much so my story as well, was that I had no idea that as somebody who was assigned female at birth, that I would be able to ever transition or deviate from that. I figured that because I was attracted to females, and because I presented a little more masculinity, I was more masculine. I just felt resigned to be a very masculine lesbian, and that's what I thought that I would be. It wasn't until I was in my early 20s, actually, that I was like on YouTube and saw somebody who was transitioning from at that time, we were using a lot of the term of FTM, or female to male, which a lot of folks don't really like to use that much anymore. But at that time, I was looking at, and so I just started searching those things up. I didn't even know FTM was a thing. So when I started looking into those things, and I was like, wow, like, this person is mirroring a lot of my internal thoughts. I didn't know that this was a thing. And the more I went, and I felt more, I saw other people being comfortable within themselves, and kind of growing. And it's really nice seeing, especially people who have documented their thoughts, and like the YouTube vloggers. So like when they're first initially thinking about things, maybe they do medically transition, maybe they don't, maybe they socially transition. Regardless, seeing the growth and the happiness from there, that's what I wanted, and that's what I went for. And had I not seen that, maybe it would have taken longer for me to come out, because these were definitely thoughts I had before. I just didn't know it was a possibility.
Thank you. The next question is, why do people feel like someone's gender is any of their business?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at how we're socialized, we're taught how to treat people according to their gender, right? There's studies that show, from the time a baby is born, depending on how they're gendered at birth, they will be raised differently. They might be held differently, or shown different types of support. And so I think there's this idea of, if I know what gender a person is, I will know how to treat them. When I guess a key message is, you don't have to know anything about a person's identity in order to show them basic human dignity and respect. And you don't need to know a person's gender in order to be kind to them. Yeah, there's this idea of, we have to know what category somebody fits into so that we know how to like gauge or adapt our behavior, when in all reality, we should just be nice to everybody, things that we learned in grade 1. Anything to add to that, Connor?
My only addition is, that's a great question. I also want to know why people feel like someone's gender is any of their business.
And which gender does GBV mostly affect?
I think we tied that into our previous answer when we were talking about trans women of color, gender diverse folks, women who are attracted to more than one gender. I think we answered that one.
And I'm a lesbian, experience this frequently. Why should I believe that society will change?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we're really sorry that you're experiencing this ongoing violence. It's not okay. It's not acceptable, and you do not deserve that. to be, I guess, a little bit more positive, though, is that personally, I feel like we're in the process of changing, and changing takes time. You know, even as I was talking about, there's youth coming out. The question before about the person's cousin and stuff, like those are all positive things. Those are things that we're even able to ask here and highlight, and people aren't automatically, you know, booing or throwing tomatoes or whatever people want to do. So the process, it's happening. Another thing is, like, we were invited to this conversation. You know, Out Saskatoon is very well known within these spaces, you know, providing queer support and to us LGBT education around. And so being invited even into this conversation shows that those subtle little changes. And in addition to that, where Jess and I got the funding for our positions and to do this work with our gender-based violence project, it was federally funded by 2 separate grants for 5 years. And that's just like not something you hear about very often. So like things are changing. And so kind of seeing things along those lines that, you know, it's kind of like with healing. It's not necessarily linear, you know, sometimes you go up, sometimes it kind of goes down, sometimes you kind of go backwards and you're like, what year are we in? And then sometimes we get a really nice push forward. And that is what I expect that we will continue doing. Jess?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is we are seeing more and more young people just understand, grasp, and go, yeah, people are free to be who they are. They're stepping into activism roles. Queer identities, two-spirit identities, trans identities are being more normalized and represented and protected. And so to this person who sent in their question, you're not alone. Your frustration is valid, your feelings are valid, and if you're needing some support, reach out. We have a lot of free resources like counseling, peer support, social groups, all the things. So get in touch with us, we got you.
And last question we have in that section is, do same-sex couples have higher or lower rates of abuse compared to heterosexual couples?
Yeah, so I think this one was also lumped in before. Connor and I were trying to find ways of being efficient with answering these. But yeah, unfortunately, they are at about the same rate or higher. And that is due to a lot of different things. So if you're like, how do I look at GBV with a queer lens? I highly recommend checking out the GBV workshop series. There are 4 modules. So you can learn all about foundations of identity, impacts of, you know, the history, colonization, how do we create change, how do we be better allies, all of this stuff. And it's free, so come.
Thanks so much. Our last topic we're going to discuss is regarding education. My question is, what can we do in the school system as teachers to help educate students on gender-based violence? What age is appropriate to start discussing this? Also, what can we do to provide support to individuals who are immersed in their issues every day? Julie?
Yeah, so this is a great question. It all starts with education. And so as a teacher, you're in a unique position to bring this issue forward. You can bring awareness to this topic and educate children to assist them in identifying language, the attitudes and beliefs, and the social norms that perpetuate gender-based violence. And that first step is educating yourself on the issue, the causes, and the ways to prevent it, and then bringing that forward into your classrooms. So as a teacher, you can advocate for more education and awareness of these issues within the curriculum. So having the curriculum, you know, be more inclusive and be more aware of this. You can decolonize your curriculum and advocate for that change so that it's not teaching some of the norms and the beliefs that can lead to gender-based violence or to any of the isms. And you can start this education as early as kindergarten. This can start with like teaching body autonomy, healthy relationships, awareness of bullying, you know, what emotional and physical violence sound like, look like, you know, teaching them to be able to identify it. Children are so uniquely accepting and they're empathetic to others, and we can socialize them and help them to recognize when something is happening that's wrong. So this is such a unique opportunity. We can create that learning environment within the school systems that gender-based violence just isn't tolerated, that it's not a social norm that we're accepting of. So you can request, you know, depending on where you're a teacher, if you're in the Northeast, NEOS, and so I'm one of the educators, I come out to the high schools, I go to any of the younger grades that invite us in. We start teaching, you know, body autonomy, healthy relationships for the older kids. We teach dating violence, sexual assault, and sexual consent. We teach, you know, about sexting and texting, their rights. We talk about language, you know, the attitudes and beliefs that fuel all of this. And so you can invite us, NEOS, or, you know, some of the other organizations that are here to come to your school. If you're not confident enough or feel like you're educated enough, there are so many resources across the province, you know, so just look for the organizations, right? So, you know, looking for the women's shelters, looking for, you know, places like Out Saskatoon for partners, for NEOS, and which one's closest to you. You know, we're all willing to share our information. Specifically, like as an adult, if you know, you yourself, and even this is also really incredible for teenagers, you know, a lot of us organizations partnered with SAS, and so we deliver a program called First Responders to Sexual Assault and Sexual Abuse. That program teaches people to be part of the prevention for sexualized violence, how to respond appropriately when a disclosure happens, but it also really educates you about the spectrum of where it starts, what you can do to get involved, how you can be an advocate, you know, for someone and against the social norms that perpetuate the violence. So being in that education system, like, this is such a huge opportunity. So if you don't feel confident in this area, please reach out to one of us, because we can help you come up with creative ideas through, you know, art, activities, you know, we can provide videos, all that kind of stuff to really teach students at an early age, you know, the activities that can help them to recognize, you know, sites of privilege, sites of oppression, you know, things like sexism, racism, you know, what the power of language does and how it influences us, and the belief systems that create gender-based violence in the beginning. So it's a really great opportunity. So I just encourage you that if you're not feeling comfortable, reach out to us. We'll come in, we'll help you get educated, and we'll help you, you know, bring in those activities to really help educate your students and other staff members.
Tricia, if I can just step in there to what Julie just said. She mentioned about starting early on. And no, when we talk education, we always think teachers, but education starts even earlier than that. And you mentioned it, Julie, about kindergarten. There are resources like you wouldn't believe for young kids to talk about this. In years gone by, when we talked about child abuse against children, and there were the tools and the books to talk about healthy relationships and people you can trust, and a whole bunch of stuff which wasn't frightening to the children, but gave them the tools to develop the knowledge to move on, so those type of things didn't happen. So again, it's the same thing. We can't always expect teachers to be able to do all this. We ourselves, as general members of the community, are the teachers. We are the ones that can probably do some of this work as well.
Thanks, everyone. And our last question, I will ask Jenna. Does Northeast Regional Victim Services have any resources available for teachers to help create awareness and to help support our students who may be experiencing GBV?
Thanks, Tricia. The answer is yes. As you've already heard from Julie and Rod and from pretty much everybody on this panel today, is that we all want to work together. And the word networking came to my mind as soon as I saw this question, that, you know, we might be the first person that the teacher's reaching out to, especially in our isolated areas. Victim Services is out there. And if anybody came to NERVS or Gateway Regional Victim Services or anywhere, I know that we're going to reach out to the professionals that can help us bring this to them. We aren't the end and all. We want to make sure that we work together. If we have a question about gender, I'm going to Jess and Connor. If I'm going for shelters, I might go to Julie. If it's human trafficking, I'm probably going to go to Haley and Rod, right? There's a lot of questions in there that we're going to bring forward and make sure that we're networking with the appropriate agencies. And, you know, just having this event today is showing that there is a lot of support out there. And we want to make sure everybody that's viewing today keeps asking those questions, keeps reaching out, maybe reach out to Jess or Julie or Haley and ask about their programming. I think it's important that you guys take ownership and take that power and ask those questions. And that's the whole idea of this panel, is to empower you to ask those questions. Because like Rod said, this should be starting early. We should be talking about gender-based violence. And, you know, NERVS is one program, but there's so many out there that provide that support. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank every single one of our panelists today who came onto the call, have been working with us behind the scenes. And you know, it's amazing what we were able to do here today. It went a little longer than expected, but I really do appreciate everybody's responses, and I hope the viewers are getting what we're putting together here today. So thank you.
And thank you, everyone. That concludes our gender-based violence virtual panel. Again, like Jenna said, a big thank you to our panelists and viewers. If anyone has any questions or concerns, please reach out to us at the Northeast Regional Victim Services. Our number is 306-878-3819. Take care, everyone, and stay safe.